One of the accusations I occasionally hear from atheists goes like this: Jesus never existed. He never even existed as a historical figure. He's simply fictional. And I particularly hear that a lot on the internet, actually. That argument hangs out in the darker corners of the atheist internet and really isn't taken seriously outside of there. For example, I don't know of a serious credentialed historian working at any mainstream university anywhere in Europe or the UK or the United States or Canada who would make that argument. In fact, what's interesting, when you actually go and look at the writings of men and women who are credentialed historians, who are working on the first century, it doesn't matter whether they are Christian or Jewish or agnostic or atheist, they would all take the view that the evidence is overwhelming that Jesus existed. In fact, let me just give you one example. One of the most famous skeptical historians writing today on early Christianity and the Bible and Jesus is a gentleman called Bart Ehrman, based at the University of North Carolina in the USA. And Bart is a very committed agnostic, almost an atheist by his definition, written many critical books on Christianity. But a few years ago, he actually felt compelled to write a book called Did Jesus Exist? And in the introduction to that book, he talks about how frustrated he is as a historian that he had to actually write that book because it's just so patently obvious when you study the evidence. But let me read you something that Bart says in that book. Towards the end of the introduction, he says, "I am not a Christian, and I have no interest in promoting a Christian cause or a Christian agenda. But as a historian, I think evidence matters, and the past matters, and for anyone to whom both evidence and the past matter, a dispassionate consideration of the case makes it quite plain Jesus did exist." Now, what kind of evidence are people like Bart Ehrman, who is an atheist historian, or the agnostics historians, or the Jewish historians, or those of all faiths and none working on the historical Jesus, what kind of evidence do they point to that makes it so overwhelmingly clear that Jesus existed as a historical figure? Well, first we have the biographical accounts of Jesus in the New Testament, what we today call the four Gospels. And in terms of their style, their genre, historians and academics would say they are Greco-Roman biographies. Their writers are clearly setting out to try to write history, not to write fiction. And in fact, the idea of trying to write fictitious history didn't really emerge until the Middle Ages, when the idea of the historical novel emerges. 1500 years earlier, nobody was doing that. And if you look at the Gospels, they are clearly constructed in the same way that we find other Greco-Roman biographies from the same period. And the first thing I would say to skeptics is all you have to do is treat the Gospels not as inspired scripture, just treat them as you would any other document from the first century. And when you do that, you discover they give you really good historical information. They give you lots of eyewitness detail. It's interesting when you read the Gospels, they are full of details about the context in which Jesus operated. We learn about the history of the region. We learn about the other political groups that Jesus was in competition with. We learn about the political structure, the economics of the area in which Jesus ministered. You can find out about the place names, the names of the characters, all kinds of information and detail packed into the Gospels that makes them look, most historians would say, like eyewitness testimony. And interestingly, where we can put them to the test and actually go and look on the ground, for example, some of the sort of geographical information that the gospel writers describe makes perfect sense when you actually go and look in the region itself. They didn't look like documents that were written decades or hundreds of years after the events by people far from the events that took place. That's the first thing. But the second thing you can do is you can go and look at other writers, other historical documents from the same time period as the Gospels, and lo and behold, Jesus turns up in their pages too. So Josephus, the Jewish historian, talks about Jesus. Tacitus, the Roman historian, talks about Jesus. And there are many other examples of where Jesus has made a little impression on the writers and those who are documenting that time period. We might add to that archaeology, interestingly enough. Many of the places and the descriptions contained in the Gospels have now been uncovered by archaeologists, and we find that time and time again, the Gospel writers know very well the things that they're talking about. When we put the Gospels to the test, they pass the test very, very well. But then finally, I think the last powerful piece of evidence for the existence of Jesus of Nazareth, many historians, be they Christian, Jewish, agnostic or atheist, would say, is the beginnings of the early church. You see, most of the early Christians, almost all of them, were Jewish. and they had a perfectly good religion that had served them for thousands of years, and they were very proud about their religion, very committed to their religion. But something caused the early church to break away from Judaism, to begin as a separate movement centered around the claim that Jesus was the Messiah, that he'd been crucified and risen from the dead. And the men and women of the early church went out and preached that message across the Greco-Roman world, many of them dying for that belief in the first few centuries of the Roman era, when the Romans were persecuting Christians mercilessly. And historians would say, if you remove Jesus from history, you are left with, as one historian put it, a Jesus-shaped hole in the middle of the first century. Much easier to take the easier route and to say that Jesus existed as a historical figure, the Gospels contain good information about him, and then we can set out, as we would any other figure from history, to discover what we can learn from the sources that have been left. And there are lots of great ways to do that, and in a short 5.5, 6 minute video we can only scratch the surface. If you want to dig a bit deeper into this topic, take a look at the book Is Jesus History? By my friend John Dixon from Australia, a qualified historian himself, and it's a wonderful introduction to what we can know about the Jesus of history.